Welcome to Beyond the Call, where history, leadership, and heroism come alive. Today's story explores Staff Sergeant Arthur DeFranzo near Vaubadon in 1944, a powerful account of courage and responsibility in combat. If you enjoy learning more about military history and extraordinary individuals, you can find more articles, podcasts, and resources at trackpads.com. His journey from a working family in Massachusetts to a wheat field in Normandy shows how an ordinary life can shape extraordinary choices. It is a story carried in memory by the men he saved and the community that sent him to war. Before we continue, I want to mention the Medal of Honor book series that accompanies this work. These books tell the stories of America's Medal of Honor recipients in a serious, readable, and historically grounded format, with each volume focused on a specific campaign, battle, or part of the war. They are available in color paperback, Kindle ebook, and matching audiobook editions. You can find them at militaryauthor.me. Arthur Frederick DeFranzo grew up in Saugus, Massachusetts, in a large family of Italian immigrants who knew more about hard work than comfort. Money was always tight. As a boy and then as a teenager, he shared close quarters with many siblings, where helping out was expected, and looking after one another was part of daily life. Those years during the Great Depression taught him to endure long days, accept responsibility early, and keep going when there was no easy way out. By the time he finished high school and stepped into the local rubber industry, he already carried the quiet habits of someone others counted on. In the rubber plant north of Boston, the work was hot, noisy, and demanding, with little glory and few breaks. DeFranzo proved himself reliable there too, the kind of man who did what needed doing, without much complaint. When he enlisted in the United States Army in November 1940, he carried that same steadiness into uniform. Training shaped him into an infantryman and then into a non-commissioned officer, responsible not just for his own performance, but for the lives of younger soldiers. Beyond the Call is the Monday feature of Dispatch, U.S. Military History magazine. Within the 18th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Infantry Division, his leadership grew from a blend of competence, patience, and example, rather than loud speeches. Before Normandy, the 1st Infantry Division had already seen hard fighting and knew what modern war meant in practical terms. DeFranzo and his fellow soldiers understood that success in combat often depended on small groups making fast decisions in terrible conditions. When they crossed the English Channel in June 1944 and landed in France, they carried that experience with them, along with the weight of the mission to drive inland from the beaches. In the days that followed, they pushed through bocage country, a landscape of small fields bordered by thick hedgerows that offered perfect cover for defenders. Near the village of Vaubadon on the 10th of June, their company received another order to advance, this time across a field that looked deceptively simple and terribly exposed. The field in front of them was planted in low grain that rose only to a man's knees, nowhere near enough to hide a moving soldier. A hedgerow behind them offered cover, but beyond lay a gentle rise and more hedges where German forces had prepared their defenses. 2 scouts were sent ahead to feel out the enemy positions, their figures clear against the pale stalks in the sky above. For a brief moment, the only sounds were the rustle of movement and distant artillery. Then German machine guns opened fire, sending long bursts that tore through the wheat and cut down one of the scouts in the open. The rest of the company dropped to the ground, pinned in place between safety behind them and the guns ahead. From his position along the hedgerow and in the thin cover of the field, Staff Sergeant DeFranzo could see the wounded scout crumpled and still. The man lay in a space with no protection, trapped between the American line and the German weapons that were now fully awake. Anyone who tried to reach him would have to move through direct, concentrated fire. Many leaders would have ordered smoke, waited for artillery, or tried to shift the line. But those options took time the wounded man did not have. DeFranzo chose a different path. He stood up in the open and ran toward the scout. Machine gun rounds lashed the field around him as he sprinted, each impact a reminder that every step might be his last. He was hit as he moved, a bullet striking his body and driving pain deep into his side. Still, he reached the wounded scout and dragged him back, body bent over the other man, hauling him yard by yard through the thin cover of torn wheat. He would not leave him there. By the time he reached the relative shelter of the shallow ground where medics could work, he was bleeding heavily and breathing hard, his own life now in real danger. Medics and comrades tried to pull DeFranzo fully into cover, insisting that he stay down and accept treatment for his wound. From their perspective, he had already done more than anyone could ask, and another man could take his place in the line. But as he looked down that line, he saw a company frozen under converging streams of fire, flattened into the earth with no clear way forward. Remaining where they were meant giving the enemy time to mark each position and finish the job. Falling back meant crossing the same open field in reverse under the same guns, a path that promised even more casualties. In his mind, the only real chance for survival lay ahead, through the very positions that were tearing into them. So wounded and already having risked his life once, DeFranzo rose again and moved back into the open. This time he was not running toward a single wounded man, but toward the main enemy positions, using his own fire and movement to disrupt the German gunners. At least 2 machine guns concentrated on him, tracking his advance with what survivors later described as unbroken streams of bullets. Each time he fired, he forced 1 or more enemy gunners to duck or shift, easing the pressure for a few seconds on the pinned men behind him. His willingness to move under that kind of fire began to tear at the paralysis gripping the company. As he pushed forward, he was hit again, knocked down and slowed but not stopped. He dragged himself up, lurched ahead, and dropped to a knee to fire carefully aimed shots before moving once more. At one point he fought on while propped on an elbow, using his free arm to signal his men to come ahead and use the brief openings he was creating. That small gesture, a hand waving forward in a field of flying bullets, carried enormous weight. It said, without words, that the path through the fire was open enough to try. It gave the younger soldiers the courage they needed to rise from the dirt and begin moving in short, desperate rushes. The more he advanced, the more the German gunners focused on him as the immediate threat. In doing so, they allowed his company to shift in bounds, using hollows and folds in the ground to close the distance. DeFranzo's body, now marked by several wounds, became the focal point for enemy weapons that otherwise might have cut down many more men. The field that had seemed endless and empty shrank step by step until he was within about 100 yards of the main position, close enough to see details and throw grenades with effect. He was paying for every yard with blood. His men were paying with fewer lives than the terrain and firepower should have demanded. Near that final stretch, as his company drew closer to his forward position, DeFranzo was struck again and collapsed once more. Even then, he refused to stay down. With what witnesses described as a last reserve of strength, he forced himself up and moved those remaining yards into range of the machine gun nest that had done so much damage. He hurled grenades into the position, destroying the gun and killing or scattering the crew who had dominated the field. In that act, he sealed both the success of the attack and the cost to himself. The wounds he had sustained were mortal, and he died as the company passed the ground he had opened with his own life. The official Medal of Honor citation for Arthur Frederick DeFranzo calls his actions conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Those formal words carry layers of meaning. Conspicuous tells us that his courage was not hidden or known only afterward. Everyone in that field could see what he did. Intrepidity points to a stubborn fearlessness. Not an absence of fear, but a decision to act despite it, again and again. The phrase, above and beyond the call of duty, acknowledges that he went far past what any order or expectation could reasonably demand. Where the citation states that he re-entered the field while at least 2 machine guns poured unrelenting fire on him, it compresses minutes of sustained danger into a single line. Those words stand in for the sound of bullets ripping through crops, the shock of impacts around his feet, and the constant knowledge that any burst could end his advance. When it notes that he pushed forward until he was within 100 yards of the enemy position, it gives a rough measure of distance that can be imagined as almost the length of a football field, crossed under direct aim. The citation's reference to his final gesture of indomitable courage is a way of saying that he chose, even after suffering multiple serious wounds, to stand and destroy the gun that threatened his men, rather than fall back or accept cover. The tactical effect of his decisions was immediate and concrete. By drawing the bulk of the fire onto himself and then eliminating a key machine gun, he allowed his company to escape a deadly trap. They advanced instead of retreating, pushing through the field and forcing the Germans to yield the ground, rather than watch Americans fall in place. Their success contributed to the wider effort to expand the fragile foothold in Normandy, where each field, crossroads, and hedgerow had to be fought over at a high cost. His sacrifice meant that this particular piece of ground was won with fewer American dead and wounded than it might otherwise have cost. The men who survived carried that knowledge with them for the rest of their lives. For DeFranzo himself, there was no return voyage, no quiet homecoming parade in Saugus, and no slow transition from war back to civilian life. His body lay in the soil of the country he had helped to liberate, while back in Massachusetts his family received the news that every wartime household dreaded. In time, the Medal of Honor was presented to them, a symbol made of metal and ribbon that stood for a son's final acts in a place they had never seen. The medal did not erase their loss. It did, however, bind their story to the larger story of a nation fighting its way across Europe, one small field at a time. Over the years, Arthur Frederick DeFranzo's name has been carried forward in official records, unit histories, and community memorials. In his hometown, his story became part of the local memory, a reminder that the young man who once worked in a rubber plant and walked familiar streets had died leading soldiers in a distant war. Within the Army, his example continued to shape ideas of what a non-commissioned officer can be when everything is at stake. For students of military history, his actions offer a clear, human example of leadership under fire, where personal risk is accepted so that others might live. Today, when people read his citation, stand before memorials that bear his name, or hear the story of that day near Vaubadon, they are invited to see beyond the formal language and the medal itself. They can picture the narrow Normandy field, the low grain, the harsh sound of machine guns, and one staff sergeant who would not stay down when his men needed him. Remembering him this way turns a line in a history book into a living example of courage, duty, and sacrifice. It keeps Arthur Frederick DeFranzo present not only as a recipient of a high award, but as a man whose choices still speak to those who study war and its costs.